This is your Marijuana Cultivation Cannabis Podcast. I'm your host, Steven Glansberg. We are broadcasting, as always, from James A. Garfield Studios. Today, we are going to be diving into the dirt. Or should I say, into the cocoa. Because we're going to be comparing the two most popular growing mediums, Coco Coir and Soil. For all you beginners out there, choosing between cocoa and soil can feel like deciding whether you want to surf on a peaceful lake or tackle the ocean's wild waves. Each medium has its vibe, its challenges, and its unique rewards. So sit tight as we break it all down for you. And hey, no worries, this episode won't be just a dry old textbook read, although it's definitely going to be packed with juicy knowledge. Before we get our hands dirty, though, I do want to remind you to please send your questions, feedback, let me know what I screwed up to contactmccpod@gmail.com. That's M as in Mary, C as in cannabis, and C as in, well, cannabis again. All right. So happy you are here. The world needs you, and let's get into it. So we are going to start with the basics of growing in cocoa versus soil. So first things first, what the heck is Coco Coir? When I first heard that, I was thinking something like the chocolate bean or coconut or I don't know. You probably noticed though, like if you've ever grabbed a coconut, it's not just like the smooth shell like a watermelon or whatever. There's that fibrous husk between the shell and the part that you eat, and that's where Coco Coir comes from. This stuff has been repurposed into growing medium, and in the last decade, it's exploded in popularity. It's just grown exponentially in terms of the old school soil that most people did over to this cocoa medium. Thing we need to know about cocoa is it's inert, meaning it doesn't have any nutrients of its own. This is great in a way, at least, because you have full control over what your plants are getting. So you're not having to deal with whatever biosphere might be in your soil. It's inert. On the other hand, we've got the classic choice, soil. Soil's been around since forever, and it's going to contain those naturally occurring nutrients and microorganisms that are going to be beneficial to your plants. So it's going to be a little more forgiving if you miss a feeding or two, because it's also eating that biosphere within your medium, which is kind of cool. Now we get controversial. The age-old fight of cocoa versus soil. When it comes to watering, this is the crux of it. A lot of folks like using soil because they don't have to water so many damn times like you do with cocoa without an automatic system. If you're growing in cocoa, as we've discussed, you're going to need to water more often. There's no way around it unless, like I mentioned, you have an automatic system. You'll have to be watering at least daily for a lot of the grow, and as you move into flowering, probably at least twice a day. But the upside of that is cocoa has excellent drainage and aeration, which means it's really hard to overwater your plants. People will say it's impossible. I've seen it done. Don't tell anybody. but it is possible. But it's a lot harder than with soil. Soil, you do hear beginners overwatering all the time. Cocoa, that's heard much less often. In soil, you've got more of a buffer for your plants. Watering can be done less frequently, maybe every 3 to 5 days, depending on the size of your pots and the environment. And the soil acts like a sponge, holding on to moisture and slowly releasing that into the plant throughout the day. But remember, too much water, especially in soil, is a problem. It can lead to things like root rot and other issues. Plus, if not careful, nutrients can build up in the soil over time, which can lead to nutrient lockout, where your plants can't take in what they need. Now, with feeding your plants, this is where cocoa really excels. Since cocoa is inert, giving it, no biosphere like soil has, you can dial in exactly what your plants need at different stages of growth. And with soil, you're working with what's already there, plus what you add. It's kind of like seasoning a dish. Too much or too little and you're in trouble. But if you get it just right, it is magic. So what are some of the benefits and challenges of each medium? Let's weigh the pros and cons. With cocoa, you've got faster growth rates because the roots have plenty of access to oxygen. It's also more environmentally sustainable compared to some types of soil, especially those peat-based soils. And for those of you who like to experiment, cocoa is versatile and pairs well with other amendments like perlite or growth stones. The downside, you're married to your plants because they'll need more frequent care. Soil, on the other hand, is the more traditional route. It's easier to start with, especially for beginners who might not have the time to be mixing up nutrient solutions every other day. Soil has a natural buffering capacity, which can prevent drastic swings in pH, a common issue in cocoa. I can certainly attest to this. But soil can be inconsistent. You might have nutrient hotspots where too much of those newts are getting formed in one spot in your medium, and then it gets in contact with the roots, and boom, newt burn. Or you might find your plants aren't getting enough or what they exactly need from the soil alone. Now, if you're like me and love using auto pots, let me tell you, both cocoa and soil work great with these systems. There are some tweaks depending on your medium of choice. If you're using cocoa, you might want to mix in some clay pebbles or perlite for extra drainage, as recommended by the Autopot guides. But this will keep your roots from getting too wet, which can happen if you're not careful with bottom-fed systems like Autopot, especially with soil. For me, if I'm doing Autopots, I'm like, might as well use cocoa. It's a little safer. It is the preferred substrate from Autopot if you talk to them. Just seems to work a little bit better. But that's just me. Just obscene. Hey, Steven. Okay, all right. Let's get into some listener questions. Thank you for sending in these on-topic questions that I posted about earlier today on my Instagram, MCC Pod. Marijuana Cultivation Cannabis Pod. MCC Pod is my username on Instagram. I'm using cocoa and notice my pH keeps drifting up. What gives? All right, so I'm going to assume he's top watering and he's measuring that runoff water that you're going to want when you're top watering using cocoa. So when I'm using cocoa, I am measuring my runoff every single day as long as there's enough runoff there for me to measure. Usually there is. But my concern really isn't the pH. My concern is the EC. The EC is going to tell us, and we'll get into this in much more in depth in a future episode, but quickly here, The EC is going to tell us a lot of what's going on within the medium of the EC of the runoff, that is. So if we're putting in 1.0 EC nutrient solution and we get out at 0.5 nutrient solution, or a 2.0 EC nutrient solution, those are two obviously issues that need to be addressed. Measuring pH runoff, I have been taught to not do that. That it gets too messed up from the grow media, and as it gets in contact with your tray on the bottom, that you're really not getting good pH data if you're measuring it from your runoff. So just focus on keeping your input dialed in, and with cocoa being inert, it should adjust and imitate and become the pH of the nutrient solutions that you're putting in it. So if you have your nutrient solutions dialed in when you put in your nutrients, you should be good to go. On to another question. I am growing in soil and I'm getting some yellowing on my leaves. Could this be a nutrient issue? Yellowing on leaves, very, very, very hard to say without a little bit more info. And even with that extra info, it would probably be hard to say. But it probably is a nutrient issue. Soil can sometimes lead to nutrient lockout, especially if you're using a lot of bottled newts on top of what's already in the soil. So try checking the pH first. Do like a slurry of your soil where you do 1 part of your soil and then 1 part in distilled water. And then you mix it up and then stick your pH pen in there and see what it says. If it's between 6 and 7, you'll be all right. But if it's outside of that range, consider giving your plants a good flush to clear up any of those built up salts that's probably causing the issue. And then, to tie this into our discussion today, another reason why folks like using cocoa is being able to fix something like this is going to be a lot faster. You're able to get that water through that cocoa much more quickly, because like we've said a million times, it's inert. It's not getting stuck in that soil where it won't drain. And those negative nutrients or negative pHs or negative ECs that are currently in your medium are able to be pushed out much more easily in that cocoa versus soil. And then another thing that I always like to talk about that I don't think gets talked about enough in terms of a benefit of using cocoa is I really don't get bugs when I use cocoa, growing indoors, of course. And that's just so nice. I hate bugs on my plants probably more than the average guy, so I'm kind of a freak about it, and so that's why I really like cocoa. But if you're like me at all, you might want to stick to cocoa. All right, let's get to one more question. I am using an auto pot system with soil, but I am having issues with the plants getting too much water. What am I doing wrong? All right. If you're new to auto pots, I would guess what you're doing wrong is you turned on your system too early before your roots had a chance to really get rooted. That was my mistake when I first got started. I was too eager to turn on my system. I'm like, hey, they look thirsty. I guess it's time for me to turn on the valve. And that wasn't the case. I ended up with overwatered plants for sure. So I got in contact with Manny over there in Autopot, and he helped me fix my issue and explain that, dude, you got to wait longer than that. I think they recommend something like 10 to 14 days these days in terms of rooting before you're turning that system on. And I think I did that in like 3 days when I first started. If that's not your issue, maybe your soil is holding on to too much water and it needs better drainage, so we can add like some perlite or clay pebbles. Soil is going to be tougher in terms of that drainage than cocoa, but even in cocoa we add perlite a lot of times, and even in cocoa, Autopot recommends that 50-50 perlite to cocoa combo. A lot of people myself included, run 100% cocoa with auto pots, but that's a story for another day. For this soil, to answer this question, try adding some clay pebbles to your soil and or perlite, and that will improve the drainage. And if you have a way to check to make sure that your soil isn't getting compacted over time, do so. This can lead to root rot in soil. And then another idea, if all of these aren't the case, sometimes we do put our reservoir too high, which is going to force too much water into our system. So just make sure that it's about 6 inches above your tallest aqua valve, and you should be good to go. So thanks so much for these questions. These were awesome. They were on topic. Like I've said, I will post in the morning on the Instagram MCC Pod what the subject of the day is and what I'm going to be recording about, which gives you an opportunity to send in questions specifically about whatever topic I might be covering, like I was covering cocoa versus soil today. Moving on to cannabis-related news. The part that I hope we can just skip in the future, where it's legal everywhere, and once you get to this point in the podcast, if you're listening to this in the future, you can just turn it the heck off. But unfortunately, we're not there yet, so here we go. I know we talked on U.S. politics a little bit in the last few episodes, specifically Kamala Harris's change of mind when it came to marijuana, and then how Trump did a similar change of mind when it came to marijuana, as of a couple days ago only. So it looked like both parties were leaning toward a positive outlook to marijuana. And like we also mentioned in a previous news segment, Kamala Harris's VP pick legalized marijuana in his state during his term. I think it was in Minnesota, I want to say. I'm not sure. I believe he's from Minnesota. I should know that. Anyway, come to find out that an article from Forbes came out, and it just headlines... Pull it up here. Harris Walls is first major ticket to support cannabis legalization. So I'm wondering if that means they actually have a platform that they're going to do that. So let's read this article together. And by the way, it's by Emily Erlin-Bow, contributor who covers cannabis. Cannabis is intersection with science, culture, and wellness. Cool. We should interview her. Anyway. Vice President Kamala Harris and her new running mate, Governor Tim Walz, just became the first major party ticket to support federal legalization of cannabis. While Harris has a complicated history, as we've touched on here, with cannabis policy, she has come out in full support of legalization in recent years, sharing that the war on drugs was an abject failure. Amen. It's time to legalize marijuana and bring justice to people of color harmed by failed drug policies, quoted Harris. She has also used her position in the Senate and Oval Office to push for pro-cannabis legislation. And like I mentioned, so they're going to talk about this here in the article as well, Walz completes the pro-cannabis ticket with a strong history of supporting cannabis reform, including signing the bill to make adult-use cannabis legal in Minnesota. That was it. Now, this is as good a time as any when we get into these sort of discussions to say that the MCC Pod does not endorse or have any opinions on any politics whatsoever. I'm just reporting the news. All right? Continuing with the article. This pro-cannabis viewpoint could work in their favor. given that the majority of voters support legalizing marijuana nationwide. According to a recent Fox News poll, 69% of voters support adult use legalization, while only 30% oppose. Meanwhile, a Pew Research poll found that 88% of voters support either medical or recreational legalization, with 57% supporting recreational legalization, while only 11% oppose. Governor Tim Walz is already gaining praise from cannabis advocates as a consistent champion of cannabis reform. Quote, "The Harris-Walz ticket is undeniably the single most progressive ticket in U.S. history when it comes to drug policy reform," explains Layli Fatehi, partner and principal at Blunt Strategies, an expert cannabis political strategist who helped with the legalization process in Minnesota. Sorry for that ring. David Culver, SVP of Public Affairs for the U.S. Cannabis Council, shared that Kamala Harris's selection of Governor Tim Walz as her running mate is a historic milestone for cannabis reform. For the first time, there will be a pro-legalization major party ticket. All right, I'm going to end there. I don't want it to sound like I am doing a pitch for these guys. It's not I'm not in that country. I can't vote on it. So I'm not pretending to know anything. I'm just reading you the news. But I'm going to stop there because it's starting to sound like an ad for that political party, and that's not what we're here for. Like I mentioned, we also talked about how Trump has opened his eyes to making weed legal as well. All right, that music telling me it's time to go. Super happy to have you again for another episode of the Marijuana Cultivation Cannabis Podcast. Having more and more fun as more and more you are finding the show and sending me stuff and sending me pictures of your plants and asking questions. I freaking love it. So keep it up. Keep an eye on my Instagram for those daily questions where I ask, hey, today we're going to talk about this on the pod. Any questions on it? And then, hopefully we can read your answer and get it answered on the pod later that night. So it's a cool deal. I don't really want to go, but I suppose I should go.